Dear brothers and sisters, we are in a month right now that the Prophet ﷺ described in a very specific way. He said about this month of Sha'aban that it is a month يَغْفُلُ النَّاسُ عَنْهُ, that people become heedless in regards to. And I wanted to spend some time with just the word that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in describing this month, because it is a word that describes a condition that is far greater than this month, but especially speaks to the moment of Sha'aban this year. I know that a lot of people are not feeling like Ramadan. I know that the general sentiment is not what it usually is a month before Ramadan, where we're usually talking about Ramadan prep. Most of us are prepping for the worst that seems to be coming in Rafah. I know that many people's hearts are not feeling the same way, that our attention span is not the same way. But this is a condition that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned about Sha'aban, a condition of ghafla, and it's especially true in regards to the condition of people today, this Sha'aban in particular. And I would argue that while this Sha'aban might not feel as important, and this Ramadan feels very different, this might actually be the most important Sha'aban that we have ever had. Why? Because if you identify that condition of ghafla, and you're able to fight it, then inshallah ta'ala it opens you up to greater possibilities of worship, a greater connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a greater connection to your ummah. But what is ghafla in the first place? What is this condition that the Prophet ﷺ is talking about? Many times we talk about sin as coming out of desire. There are sins that emanate out of shahwa. There are sins that emanate out of desire. And then there are sins that emanate out of pride. And usually when you talk about the sins that emanate out of desire, they are the sins in which we waste ourselves away in that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically told us to keep away from. Sins out of pride tend to manifest themselves in dhulm, in actually harming others, because you tend to violate the sanctity of people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told you to not violate. But then there are sins that emanate out of ghafla. And ghafla is a spectrum of heedlessness. The lowest of it, and the one that the ulama say that the believer has to identify quickly and remedy, is indifference. Indifference. What does it mean to be indifferent to the world around you or indifferent to the news around you? Well, first and foremost, think about the Prophet ﷺ and the society that he was sent to. How many people do you think heard the message of Islam, heard the Prophet ﷺ preaching, and said to themselves, you know what? This isn't really that important to me right now. This seems to be an affair that belongs to Quraysh, that belongs to some of the elites and the nobles, that concerns the pilgrimage and some of the structure of Meccan society, but it really doesn't bother me or concern me as an individual. Meaning they simply did not even bother with the inquiry while the Prophet ﷺ was in their midst. And you would be surprised to know that this actually was the majority of people in Mecca. It kind of flips the whole seerah lens for you when you think of it that way. The majority of people just didn't care enough to get involved. And how do we know that? By the sheer amount of numbers that embraced Islam in Fatih Mecca, and the conquest of Mecca. The sheer amount of people that were present in Mecca that day. How many persecuted the Prophet ﷺ? You could name the majority of them. And it was usually a familiar few. How many followed the Prophet ﷺ? 100 or so in those early days. How many just observed and remained in a state of ghafla, a state of indifference? The majority said, you know what? They'll settle this affair amongst themselves, and at that point, when I have to make a decision, when it is right at my door, then I'll make a decision, because that's the condition of most people. And then maybe that ghafla gets a little bit more disturbed when you see some of the torture that's happening, right? Where, wait a minute, now they're pulling the slaves into the streets. They're dragging them. They're beating their own brothers, their own cousins, torturing their own sisters. This is disturbing me a little bit more, but you know what? At the end of the day, even that became commonplace in Mecca. It became normalized. Where in the beginning, Abu Jahl tested the limits, the Fir'aun tested the limits, and eventually becomes normalized. And most people will say, you know what, that's not my brother, that's not my sister, that's not my tribe. I can still just be a regular Meccan and go to the store and purchase and attend the festivals and away from all the politics of the Hajj, enjoy the pilgrimage season, and I'm okay. That's ghafla. And that's why the majority of the times that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word ghafla, wa antum ghafilun, is actually in Meccan society, because it is a more appropriate diagnosis of Meccan society at the time. You know what it reminds me of today, when you have some prominent people that'll be asked about Palestine. What do you have to say about Palestine? Oh, I haven't looked into that. I really don't know about all that. I don't care. When they say silence in complicity is complicity, you better believe silence is complicity when over 30,000 people have been killed. Yes, silence is absolute complicity. What do you mean? I really don't know about all those kids, and I can't diagnose all of that. You know, it's too much for me to get involved with, too complicated. It's not, Palestine's not here at the end of the day. That's a lot of people around you, by the way. A lot of people around you that drive around, they see the protests, they see the news, they flip and say, you know what? I'm just getting home from work today, and I just want to watch something that's going to be entertaining. I'm really not that interested in that. And you know who knows that ghafla better than anyone else? The Israeli government. Why do you think in the most watched sporting event in America, hundreds of millions of people are tuned in to men who are paid thousands and millions of dollars in full pads, who have their names on their jerseys? While Israel carries out the most brutal assault on Gaza to date, matching the time of kickoff, knowing that most people are not going to bother inquiring why there's an image that's popping up on their social media feed of a young girl that's dangling without her legs and brutalized over a wall. That's ghafla. It is sinful for you to look at that and say, not my business, or too bad, or let me move on, because I don't know how to reconcile with this or reason with this. Allah Azza wa Jal connects that to forgetfulness of Him, forgetfulness of them, and forgetfulness of yourself. That's ghafla, a state of ghafla. It's indifference.